November 1st, 1755, 9:40 in the morning. Lisbon held 200,000 people, the fifth largest capital in Europe, the center of a maritime empire that stretched from Brazil to Goa to the coast of West Africa. The feast day that kept every church in the city full saved the port workers who were already in the open streets. The geography that made Lisbon wealthy, built on sedimentary fill at the mouth of the Tagus, amplified the shaking that destroyed it, and the questionnaire that the Secretary of State sent to parish priests across the country in the weeks after the disaster became the founding document of a scientific discipline that didn't yet have a name. This is not the story of a city that was destroyed. It is the story of what that destruction produced, and why what was built in its aftermath is still standing. Subscribe, because this channel investigates what history buried, and this particular morning buried more than a city. To understand what Lisbon lost in 6 minutes, it is necessary to understand what Lisbon was on the morning of November 1st, 1755. The city was not merely large, it was consequential in a way that few cities in European history had been. Lisbon sat at the mouth of the Tagus River, facing the Atlantic directly, and that geographic fact had made it the pivot of the most profitable trading empire of the previous 2 centuries. The gold and diamonds extracted from Brazil's interior were still flowing into Lisbon's treasury, at a rate that had made the Portuguese crown one of the wealthiest in Europe. The city reflected that wealth in stone. The Baixa, the lower city, was a dense grid of commercial streets running between the waterfront and the hills above. The buildings were 4 and 5 stories of solid masonry, load-bearing stone walls with no internal skeleton, no framework to distribute lateral force, no mechanism for absorbing the kind of movement that was coming. They were heavy, rigid, and vertical. In engineering terms, they were precisely the wrong kind of structure to be standing on the geology beneath Lisbon. That geology mattered enormously. The oldest districts of the city were built on bedrock, but the Baixa, the commercial heart, the warehouses, the merchant buildings along the waterfront, sat on soft sedimentary fill deposited over centuries in what had once been a shallow estuary. Soft sediment amplifies seismic waves. It moves more, oscillates longer, and transmits shaking to the surface at greater intensity than bedrock does. Engineers today call this phenomenon soil amplification. In 1755, nobody had a name for it. Nobody knew it was happening. The buildings in the Baixa simply stood where the commerce was, and the commerce was where the river made trade convenient. On the morning of November 1st, that geography became a death sentence. November 1st was the Feast of All Saints, one of the most important religious holidays in the Catholic calendar. Across Lisbon, the churches had been open since before dawn. Thousands of candles burned on altars throughout the city. The cathedral, the Church of São Paulo, the Convento do Carmo, the basilicas in the upper districts, all of them were packed with worshippers attending morning mass. Estimates from parish records and survivor accounts suggest that the churches of Lisbon may have held between 15,000 and 30,000 people at the moment the first shock arrived. At the waterfront, the market was operating. The Ribeira market, one of the largest in Iberia, had drawn merchants, sailors, and buyers to the open quays since early morning. The royal palace faced the water directly. The city was full and active on a morning when every religious institution in the country was in simultaneous use. That simultaneity was not incidental to the death toll. It was central to it. Contemporary estimates, built from partial census records and survivor accounts compiled after the fact, placed the dead anywhere between 10,000 and 90,000. The figure used most commonly in historical literature, 60,000, is a reconstruction, not a count. The fires that followed destroyed the parish records that would have made precision possible. The number is the best available approximation of a catastrophe that erased most of its own evidence. The earthquake arrived in 3 distinct phases. The first shock began at approximately 9:40 in the morning. Survivors described it as a low rumbling that built rapidly into violent lateral motion. The second phase, arriving within minutes of the first, was stronger. The third followed shortly after. In total, the ground shook for somewhere between 3.5 and 6 minutes, depending on which survivor account is consulted, a variation that reflects how differently human memory records terror, not a discrepancy in the physical event. 3.5 minutes is not a long time. It is long enough for a 5-story masonry building with no internal structure to lose its lateral stability, begin to lean, and collapse inward. That is what happened across the Baixa and along the waterfront. Building after building folded. The masonry did not crumble gradually. It failed suddenly, releasing its full weight onto whatever and whoever was inside. The churches, with their high stone vaults and heavy decorative ceilings, came down on their congregations. The Convento do Carmo, whose Gothic arches had stood since the 14th century, lost its roof entirely. The geography of survival that morning was almost perfectly inverse to the geography of wealth and religious observance. People working in the open docks, people in the streets, people on the higher rocky ground of the Barro Alto. Many of them survived the first 30 seconds. People inside churches, inside the dense masonry blocks of the Baixa, inside the great civic buildings near the waterfront. Many of them did not. What happened offshore had already begun forming before the last stone finished falling. The earthquake that destroyed Lisbon was not born beneath Lisbon. The rupture originated in the Atlantic Ocean, approximately 200 kilometers southwest of Cape St. Vincent, the southwesternmost point of the European continent. It occurred along one of the most geologically complex boundaries on Earth, the zone where the Eurasian plate and the African plate converge at a rate of roughly 4 millimeters per year. That number sounds negligible. Over centuries and millennia, it is not. Stress accumulates along the boundary structures of this zone until the accumulated strain exceeds what the rock can hold. Then it releases all at once. On November 1st, 1755, it released catastrophically. The magnitude of the event has been estimated by multiple teams of seismologists working from historical records, damage patterns, tsunami data, and macroseismic intensity reports. The range is 8.5 to 9.0 on the moment magnitude scale. The honest answer is that the 1755 earthquake was one of the most powerful seismic events in recorded European history. Beyond that, precision becomes argument. What the historical record does establish with confidence is the rupture length. Researchers have estimated the fault rupture extended somewhere between 180 and 300 kilometers along the ocean floor. That rupture displaced the seafloor vertically, lifting an enormous column of water above it, and sent seismic waves propagating outward in every direction at speeds between 3 and 8 kilometers per second. Those waves reached Lisbon in less than a minute. What they found when they arrived was a city built on precisely the wrong foundation. The sedimentary fill of the Baixa acted as seismologists now know. Soft soil always acts under strong shaking. it amplified the incoming waves, extending their duration and increasing the intensity of ground motion well beyond what the bedrock districts experienced simultaneously. The hills of Lisbon shook. The lower city oscillated. A masonry building, stone or brick mortared together without internal reinforcement, is strong in compression. It can bear vertical load for centuries. It is almost entirely incapable of resisting lateral force. When an earthquake arrives, it pushes buildings sideways. The upper stories of a masonry building, struck by lateral acceleration, have no mechanism for transferring that force. They shear. In the churches, the dynamics were worse. Gothic and Baroque vaulted ceilings concentrate horizontal thrust at the tops of their supporting columns. Under lateral seismic acceleration, that thrust became uncontrollable. The ground was still settling when the Atlantic delivered the second catastrophe. 40 minutes after the first shock, survivors who had made it to the waterfront noticed something that no one in the city had a framework for understanding. The Tagus River was disappearing. The water at the quays was receding, not slowly, like a tide going out, but rapidly, visibly, pulling back from the stone steps of the docks and continuing to pull until the riverbed was exposed. Ships that had been floating in the harbor were settling onto wet mud. The sea floor of the estuary, never seen before by anyone alive, appeared in daylight in the middle of a November morning. Thousands of people moved toward the water. Some went to retrieve valuables from capsized boats. Some went because the open space of the waterfront seemed safer than the collapsing streets behind them. Nobody understood what was coming. The withdrawal of the sea before a tsunami is not random. It is mechanical. When the ocean floor ruptures along a thrust fault, one side of the break rises and the other drops. The displaced water column radiates outward from the rupture zone as a series of long-period waves. As these waves approach a coastline and the ocean shallows, they compress. Their wavelength shortens. Their height increases. And in the trough between the first wave and the crest of the second, the sea appears to retreat. That retreat lasted approximately 20 minutes in Lisbon. Then, the first wave arrived. The first wave arrived with a sound like a cannon volley. A deep, percussive report followed immediately by the water rising at the quays with extraordinary speed. But the first wave was not the largest. Researchers have estimated the second wave reached approximately 6 meters above normal sea level. 6 meters is the height of a 2-story building. It arrived traveling fast enough that the people who had gathered at the waterfront during the withdrawal had no viable path of retreat through the rubble behind them. 3 waves struck Lisbon in the space of roughly 90 minutes. The intervals between them were long enough to draw people back toward the waterfront after each apparent retreat. The reach of those waves extended far beyond Lisbon. Along the Algarve coast in southern Portugal, the tsunami was catastrophic. Villages along the coast lost buildings to the waterline. In Morocco, the tsunami hit the Atlantic coast with enough force to kill thousands, a death toll that the historical record has consistently undercounted because European documentation concentrated almost exclusively on Lisbon. The wave continued north, causing unusual tidal surges in Ireland and Cornwall. Across the Atlantic, the wave reached Martinique and Barbados, where harbor records noted inexplicable rises in sea level. It was, to that point in recorded history, the most geographically extensive seismic sea wave ever documented. What remained of Lisbon's waterfront, after 3 waves and 6 hours, was unrecognizable. The great trading port, the commercial infrastructure of an empire, The stone quays that had launched ships to India and Brazil had been restructured by water in less than a morning, and the fire had not yet started. This channel documents the full chain of events that history collapses into a single word: disaster. If that chain matters to you, subscribe. The next link is already burning. The earthquake struck at 9:40 in the morning. The tsunami arrived 40 minutes later. The fires began almost immediately after the first shock, and they burned for 6 days. The ignition sources were everywhere and entirely predictable. Every church in Lisbon had been burning candles since before dawn. Every household altar had been lit for the feast day. When the buildings collapsed, those candles fell into the rubble. The rubble was wood and fabric and paper and the contents of kitchens. In the hours after the earthquake, dozens of separate fires began in different districts simultaneously. Under normal circumstances, Lisbon had mechanisms for fighting fires. Under the circumstances of November 1st, 1755, none of them functioned. The fire brigades could not move through streets blocked by collapsed buildings. The water supply infrastructure had been damaged. The tsunami had driven salt water through the lower streets, destroying water reserves, and the wind that afternoon was moving inland from the sea, feeding oxygen to fires spreading through collapsed wooden roof structures. By nightfall on November 1st, the fires had merged into a continuous conflagration. Survivors described the sky over Lisbon as permanently orange for the next 6 days. The heat in the lower city was reported as sufficient to melt metal objects in the street. The fire ultimately destroyed as much of the city as the earthquake and tsunami combined. What the fires destroyed is partially knowable and partially not. The royal palace on the waterfront burned for days. With it went one of the largest royal libraries in Europe, including irreplaceable manuscripts from the age of exploration. The administrative center of Portugal's entire Indian Ocean trading network burned. The records of ship manifests, trade agreements, and navigational charts were reduced to ash. The archive of the Inquisition burned. The records of the city's notaries burned. The baptismal and death records of many of Lisbon's parishes, which would have provided the most accurate accounting of who died, burned. This is the paradox that sits at the center of the historical record of 1755. The fires consumed the primary sources of the event they were part of. The estimate of 60,000 deaths is a reconstruction built from partial records and population modeling. The actual number cannot be recovered because the mechanism by which such precision would have been established was itself destroyed. The fires did not just kill people, they killed the evidence. The fires finally died on November 6th. What they left behind was not ruins in the conventional sense. It was a cleared site, a flat, ash-covered plain. On the afternoon of November 1st, while the fires were still spreading, King José I asked his Secretary of State what was to be done. The Secretary of State was Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo. His answer was brutal in its clarity: bury the dead and heal the living. He ordered the bodies buried at sea to prevent epidemic disease. He deployed the military to enforce price controls on food and building materials. He established a cordon around the city to prevent mass emigration, reasoning that a city emptied of its skilled labor force cannot rebuild itself. These measures were invented in the field in the first 72 hours. The reconstruction problem was different in kind from the emergency response. Lisbon needed to be rebuilt. For that, Carvalho e Melo turned to Manuel de Maia, the chief military engineer. The option adopted was the most radical. a new baisha built on a rectilinear plan, with streets wide enough that a collapsing building on one side could not reach a building on the other, and with a structural system designed specifically to resist the lateral forces that had destroyed the original city. That structural system is now called the Gaiola Pombalina, the Pombaline cage. The engineers developed a building system in which a wooden structural framework was embedded within the masonry walls of every new building. The wooden cage gave the structure the ability to deform under lateral loading without immediate collapse. Masonry can carry vertical load. Wood under seismic stress can flex. The combination produced a building that could absorb earthquake motion without losing structural integrity. This was the first deliberately earthquake-resistant building system in the history of European architecture. The questionnaire that Carvalho e Melo sent to parish priests across Portugal in the months following the earthquake was the other invention of 1755 that changed the future. The questions were precise. How long did the shaking last? In which direction did suspended objects swing? Which buildings fell and which stood? The answers produced the first systematic macroseismic intensity map in the history of natural science, a document that showed how seismic intensity diminishes with distance from a point of origin. John Michell at Cambridge used those compiled accounts as the primary evidence for his 1760 paper, proposing that earthquakes were wave phenomena propagating through the Earth from a point source, the conceptual foundation of modern seismology. The chain from Pombal's questionnaire to the existence of seismology as a discipline is direct and unbroken. What was built in the Baixia between 1758 and 1775 still stands, engineered to keep them standing through the next major earthquake. The next block goes to the philosophers, and they were not prepared for what November 1st had done to their arguments. In the middle of the 18th century, the dominant philosophical framework for understanding natural catastrophe in Europe was simple. God had created the best of all possible worlds, and suffering was either punishment, trial, or a component of a larger providential design. This argument had the advantage of explaining everything. It had the disadvantage, after November 1st, 1755, of explaining nothing. Voltaire read the news from Lisbon in late November. His response was a poem, published in 1756, titled Poem on the Disaster of Lisbon. The poem did not describe the earthquake, it prosecuted it. He asked what the 60,000 dead of Lisbon had done to deserve their deaths. If this was part of a providential design in which everything was for the best, Voltaire had concluded that the word best had lost its meaning. Jean-Jacques Rousseau read the poem and was furious. He responded with a letter to Voltaire in which he offered a counter-argument. Rousseau's argument was not theological. It was urban. The people of Lisbon, he wrote, had died not because God had failed them, but because they had chosen to build a city of 20,000 houses, 6 and 7 stories high, on a narrow strip of land. Nature had not killed 60,000 people. The concentration of human beings in dense masonry cities had placed those people in the path of exactly the kind of event that geology made inevitable. The exchange between Voltaire and Rousseau became one of the most consequential intellectual disputes in European history. Immanuel Kant, then 31 years old, published 3 separate essays on the Lisbon earthquake in 1756. He did not write philosophy. He wrote natural science. He attempted to reconstruct the probable dimensions of the fault rupture from the distribution of aftershocks. He applied the tools of natural philosophy to a catastrophe that his tradition had previously assigned to the category of divine action. What died in Lisbon in 1755 was not just 60,000 people. It was a way of explaining why they had to. The fault that produced the earthquake of 1755 is still there. It has not moved significantly since November 1st of that year, which is precisely the point. The fault system along the boundary zone southwest of Cape St. Vincent, likely a segment of the broader Azores-Gibraltar plate boundary, though the precise structure responsible for the 1755 rupture remains a subject of active geological debate, does not release strain continuously. It accumulates it. The 4 millimeters per year of relative plate motion is stored in the rock, adding to a deficit that will eventually resolve in another rupture. The question of when is not one that seismology can answer with precision. What it can answer is what the historical and geological record shows about recurrence. Seismologists have documented evidence of at least 2 previous tsunami-genic earthquakes on this fault system before 1755, one dated to approximately 1000 BCE, another to around 200 CE. The interval between the 200 CE event and 1755 is roughly 15 centuries. This fault system produces catastrophic ruptures, and the intervals between them are measured in centuries, not millennia. 270 years have passed since 1755. Lisbon today holds approximately 550,000 people within the city limits. The Baixa Pombalina still stands. But Lisbon expanded aggressively in the 20th century, often without seismic design requirements adequate for the fault environment beneath it. The gap between what the fault can produce and what the built environment can absorb has not closed since 1755. It has widened because the population exposed to the risk is larger. What has changed is the knowledge. The modern seismic monitoring network across the country provides real-time data. Early warning systems for tsunami detection are operational across the Portuguese Atlantic margin. 40 minutes separated the earthquake of 1755 from the first tsunami wave. In a modern city with functional communications, 40 minutes is a meaningful interval. In 1755, nobody knew what the retreat of the Tagus meant. Today, that knowledge exists. What is written in the sediment layers beneath the Portuguese coast is a pattern, not a prediction, not a sentence. A pattern that has been accumulating since before Voltaire asked his question and will continue accumulating long after the answer has been forgotten. The difference between 1755 and now is not the fault. It is the 40 minutes between the first rupture and the first wave. In 1755, no one knew what the retreat of the Tagus meant. Today, that knowledge exists in monitoring networks, in early warning systems, in the engineering encoded into every building still standing in the Baixa Pombalina. The question that Lisbon 1755 actually leaves open is not geological. It is institutional. Whether a city that knows exactly what is coming has used those 40 minutes to prepare, or has simply learned to forget more efficiently than the sediment does.